Hey guys, so this is my presentation, Deaf and Language in Isabel Quintero's Gabi Pieces, and let's just get straight to it. So on a broad level, I wanted to ask the question, how does deaf and language function together in Quintero's Gabi Pieces? And I wanted to ask this because deaf is a reoccurring topic for Gabi, whether it's the deaf of her father, or as we'll explore in a moment, the deaf of her grandfather and grandmother. But also language is a specific function in the text, as we'll see in a moment as well. On a more specific level, I wanted to ask, how does the protagonist's linguistic shift between English and Spanish reflect her inner conflict of accepting the death of a loved one and remembering their life? So essentially, just is there a conveyance, is there meaning by switching between English and Spanish, which isn't always translated, one way to another? And these images here are, as you may recall, taken from the main cover of the book itself. And I wanted to kind of spread them out here because as in their original creation, they may represent or reflect ideas of woman empowerment and representation or feeling. There's also a conveyance of death here. In deconstructing the organic body, there's this sense of deconstructing life too, as we can see in the heart being taken out of the chest, the bones exposed here, the Gabbies being crossed out here. There's a different kind of meaning in that. So this is pretty simple to read just from left to right as these quotes go, sorry. And then down below here are the main academic resources. And they don't really pair to any specific quote because they act as the main foundation for all the quotes, as you'll come to see. So let's just go ahead and start. The first quote here is when Gabby first writes her poem for poetry class, and it's titled When Your Grandfather Dies. So the first thing to notice here is the way I've broken it up. So this first half is literally the first line of the poem, but the second half will be midway through the poem, and this is a trend that continues to the next quote. So I'll go ahead and read this quote out loud. When your grandfather dies, ask yourself. Again, that's the beginning, and then midway we get to, that's not abuelito who bought you dosis de coco raspados and bolitas. That's not him in that box. So one of the first things I wanted to point out is how this poem is structured. So it's second point of view, and in that point of view, it asks the reader to kind of fill in the role of the creator, as in imagining who this grandfather figure is. So it essentially just makes a very impersonal impression for Gabby as the author of the poem. But then we see as the poem goes on that it becomes a lot more specific. We see this narration of the dosis de coco raspados and palitas. And the interesting thing to note is that these kind of differences are conveyed through the language that's used. So if we look down below to Ashley Hope and Patricia Incesco's quote here, which I'll read, Spanish emerges as a language of euphemism and decorum, as English is the language of extroversion and directness. We can see this idea of language being a resource. And while I agree with Hope and Cisco to a point, there's a certain part which I disagree with, and that's when they claim English is the language of extroversion. It's actually more so the language of introversion. It's the language which Gabby uses to distance herself from something, at least on an emotional level. And we can see this here um, when this English term of grandfather is used in conjunction with death, very negative thing. But yet it's also very vague, it's very direct, as Hope and Cisco would say it. But compare that to Abuelito, who's very specific. It's in a different language, it's in the Spanish counterpart, but with this narration, with this specificness, there's much more life into it. And that's the main point here that we can see. When Gabby's using this English term, she's kind of being foreign or recognizing her grandfather post-mortem as being a very foreign figure, a very foreign state. But when remembering his life, he becomes Abuelito. So in a way, you can think of them as two different characters. And we can really see the difference, the stark difference between Spanish and English in the second half right here. This Spanish here is very specific. It adds life into the character of Abuelito. But then following that is a pure English statement. That's not him in that box. Very vague, very foreign, but yet very direct. So what do we say? So what can we get from here specifically is that Gabby, her inner conflict of accepting death is conveyed through English by kind of looking at the negative aspect of death as a foreign state, whereas Spanish is used to embrace the memory or good side of death. And I use that phrase kind of specifically regarding the second quote here, which I'll read out loud. When your grandmother forgets, she will forget how to knit, how to make tortillas, or why she exists. And when your abuela dies, you will feel guilty because, well, because you are thankful. So again, language is being used as a resource here, as we can see as the English term grandmother and the Spanish term abuela are used at different points of the poem. However, it's actually a complete opposite from the previous quote. Here, we see that grandmother is used in conjunction with this word forgets, and forgetting is something you very much do when you're alive, of course. But then in the later part, actually, I should say this is actually the ending of the poem. And this is also the first time where Gabi, as a narrator, refers to her grandmother as abuela. It's used in conjunction with death. So immediately we see this very stark uh, juxtaposition from the previous quote, where the English term of grandfather is used right next to death, and abuelito is used next to life. Again, language is a resource. So what can we make out of this specific quote? Well, what I say is that sorry, what I say is that it basically turns Gabby's concept on its head. It kind of twists her inner conflict to convey that there's more depth to it, there's more complexity to it, namely that there's an ideological state of death. When her grandmother is suffering through presumably early stages or late stages of Alzheimer's, she is in this ideological state of death, which is foreign, which is distant, which is something that Gabi is very direct about. But that, but yet, when she dies, she is now referred to as abuela. There is this kind of peaceful passing, and it just goes to show on a kind of subtle level that Gabi admits that there can be a justification for death. There can be a good result of one dying if they're in an ideological state of death before or suffering before physical death. And this all builds up to this third quote here. I shouldn't have to worry every night that we'll get a call telling us someone found you in a park, beaten, overdosed, or dead. I know you're tired of living like this. Papi, I love you. Te quiero con todo mi corazón. Come back, please. And what's interesting here is you'll notice by the page number in the quotation or citation is that it precedes the two poems that we've talked about before. So it's interesting that on a kind of chronological level, this precedes these poems, but on a thematic level, it is, or how do you say, we require these two poems to really understand this quote in particular. And this is where we start to get Quintero's own idea that there's no restraint in writing. As she says, writing gives me an opportunity to sort out my thoughts and try and find myself. There is no hiding from the self there, and that's a good thing. And though at the time she meant this in regards to diversity and showing your true self, we can also just emphasize the fact that there is no restraint. And that's what we get here, as this quote is taken out of a letter that Gabby is writing to her father inside her diary. So there is this ironic kind of twist on this letter, in that it's being written in a format which is directed for someone to read, but that person will never read it. So why should she start using linguistic shifts, something which she kind of marks in her previous poems deliberately? Well, we can just say that there is no restraint. Rather of thinking as this as Gabby's deliberate stylistic choice, it's much more of a stylistic choice. It's something which reflects her inner conflict. And again, language is a resource. And we could see this conflict just happening in the language itself. Papi, I love you. The English is mixed with the Spanish. And Gabby can even tell that there's this English I love you isn't sufficient enough. It's not romantic enough. It's not specific enough again. That's why she follows it by saying "Te quiero con todo mi corazón" to kind of reaffirm the love that she has for him. But even if you just look at how Spanish is used, very sparingly here, whereas English is this kind of language of just violence, beaten, overdose, or dead. Come back, please. The fact that this is in English could maybe convey that, hey, Gabby isn't really sure if she wants him to come back. But why is that? Well, as we can see, oh, sorry. As we can see in the conclusion down there, as I write, in Isabel Quintero's Gabby or Go in Pieces, Gabby's reoccurring linguistic shifts between English and Spanish emphasize her ideological conflict of accepting the strange death of a loved one and remembering them fondly, which culminates in Gabby identifying her father in an ideological state of death before his physical death. So, at the end of the day, that's pretty much the encapsulation of her inner conflict. Though she can't really recognize, or she has trouble recognizing those who have passed, there's also a sense of knowing that sometimes passing away is better than living and suffering. Be it when it comes to her father, she can't really agree whether he should pass away for the better or really try to keep alive and change his life. So yeah, that's my presentation, and thank you.